Right, I think we'll make a start. So welcome everyone to this session on labour unrest in platform work, a global perspective. I'm Mark Stuart from the University of Leeds, and I'm going to be chairing the session today. It's a session that is somewhat disrupted by the current crisis, notably the travel limitations for colleagues. This was going to be a session with a mix of activists and academics, with contributions from India, Mexico, the US, and also a global perspective. Unfortunately, the number of speakers is significantly reduced, so we are left with just 2 contributions. So I hope you will hang around and listen to these. We have a paper from Simon Joyce at the University of Leeds, who's going to talk to us about a global struggle, worker organizing and protest in platform work. And this will be followed by Doellgast, who's going to act as a discussant. So Simon, I think if you can talk for 20-25 minutes, you have plenty of time today. And Ginny, I guess you can have 10 or 15 minutes, and then we can open up for general discussion, debate, and contributions. And please, colleagues, feel free to pose questions in the chat function as we go along, and I will try to keep an eye on these and then field the questions. So Simon, if you're ready, would you like to start? Perhaps share your screen if you need to, and start your presentation.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. It's nice to see some familiar names and faces, and also nice to meet some new people. I've been planning to try and kind of mix up slides and me talking, because I thought it would be just a bit less boring than having one slide after another, but I'm not quite sure how well it's going to work. Unlike a lot of you who've been doing online lectures and classes for some time, I'm a research fellow, so I don't get to do this. So if the gaps show, you'll have to just bear with us, and Mark can instruct. So yeah, in that case, let's just see if this works. Mark, do I go into slideshow and then share my screen? Can I do that, or I just...
If you just press share screen, that should basically give access to everything on your desktop.
Yeah, got it. Okay. So is that working? Have you got that, Mark?
Yes, that's working, Simon.
Okay.
We can all see this now.
I just thought I'd do the title. So, Labour Unrest in Platform Work, a Global Perspective. So, as Mark said, we've been hoping to have a number of speakers, but for various kind of funding and travel and activism reasons, it kind of fell to pieces. So, I've been planning to present some work I've been doing with Mark and some colleagues at Leeds, where we've essentially attempted to construct a global database of platform worker protests to try and, in the literature, I'm not going to talk too much about the literature and the research has been done. I'm going to kind of assume that people are already familiar with it, at least to some extent. But to date, the research on organisation and collective organisation resistance among workers in platform work is largely case study research, and some of it's really good and interesting, but it's been much more difficult to get a kind of global overview of what the general bigger picture is, and that's what we've tried to do here. We're still in the early stages. We've done 2 stages really so far, a kind of experimental one, and then attempting to develop it more systematically. but there's obviously still a lot to do. So I'll be interested to hear what you've got to say about where we've got to so far and where we might be going, where we should maybe go next. So I'll let me. Okay, I'm trying to unshare my screen. Has that unshared my screen? No, I've done it now.
Yes, okay. It has. It has.
Okay, great, thanks. So, yeah, what I want to talk about, we've developed what we've called the Leeds Index of Platform Labour Protest, and I'm going to talk about how we've done it and something about what the findings so far are. Basically, the findings, we've assembled a database of several hundred platform worker protest events of various types, and I'll talk a bit more about how we've done it and what types of protests we've assembled. And we've attempted to look at the research questions we've looked at are: what are the scale and extent of platform worker protest? What forms do platform worker protests take? What issues are driving platform worker protests? And what, if any, forms of collective organisation are emerging? So those are the questions we've tried to answer. And our findings so far, that's kind of the key findings, is globally, pay is the main cause of protest by a long stretch, by a long way. So although the literature on platform work and the experience of platform work is often dominated by discussions of algorithmic issues, when you look at worker protests, it's actually pay, the good old-fashioned industrial relations issue that comes very much to the fore. And regarding secondary issues, there are often secondary issues involved, such as employment status, working conditions, and so on. They vary geographically. There's more variety in those, and we can say something about why they vary the way they do. Also, the forms of protests that we see vary quite substantially according to geography, according to setting. That's probably linked to, looks like it's linked to institutional settings, much more so than by industry. So there's geographical variation, much more so than industrial variation. Mainstream unions, traditional unions, established unions feature in Western Europe. In the globe, although we do see the new grassroots unions that are emerging in Western Europe as well. In the global south, it's almost, if there's any unions involved at all, it's new grassroots unions. But what we find is that generally, although there is involvement of newer grassroots unions and mainstream established unions, and also some other non-union forms of worker organisation, this is really a platform worker protest at present is really a phenomenon that's driven by the rank and file, the old-fashioned term, the rank and file. It's groups, informal groups of workers, sometimes unionised, sometimes not unionised, who are really driving what's going on here. So we had this idea of trying to compile a global database last year. At some point we'd like to put online an interactive map with what we found. The initial search strategy we used was looking at news media reports, following online tech journalism and reporting, which actually these days is quite a good source of reporting on small-scale worker struggles in the platform, in platform work. Activist websites, union websites, and so on. It's something that I've personally been tracking for a few years, pulling together the examples I could find. And that was the first database we compiled, the first version of it. When we looked at what we had to think about definitions of what we would count. So we were counting instances of platform worker protests, protest events, and we included obvious ones like strikes and log-offs, where workers log off from the app for a period of time, demonstrations and protests. There's also quite a lot of legal action, workers pursuing court cases over, especially over classification or misclassification of employment status. And then we found also a smaller number of something that we couldn't ignore, that we've termed institutionalization, which is essentially where things like there's platform workers in Europe who formed workers' councils, platform workers in Japan who founded unions, and these kinds of things which didn't really fit with some of the other categories. So we started recording those as well. So I'll show you a picture now. The first version we had was this one. Share screen. So here's the chart. So this is the first version of that we came up with. So this was sort of a 3.5-year period from January 2015 to May 2019. It's a total of 324 platform worker protest events, and so that's each month as we go through with a bar and a trend line. So you can see this is an upwards trend of platform worker protests over that period. Obviously, 324 instances is a good start, but it's really only a start. A little way in, we discovered that there was already a source of reports, online news reports, where we could search for platform worker protest events. And that was this one. So this is GDELT. It's as it says, database of global online news media. It's a huge database. It runs with some of the Google cloud databases. It's a huge database. It monitors worldwide news reports with real-time translation. There's over 100 languages. It's fully searchable since 2017, more difficult before that, but you can run searches which pulls up reports according to the contents of the searches. And we started searching this. We figured out that this was a good source of reports of platform worker protests, and we started looking at this. We decided for the second round of the database studies to focus on cooked food delivery platforms, because there's the numbers here, the numbers of protest events, of reports of protest events is very large, and we decided to focus on one sector where we know there's been a reasonably significant amount of worker contestation. We picked 18 companies. I can give you the names if you want. There's 6 global companies in this sector. And then for geographical regions, we looked for the larger companies. We made sure that we'd covered all the regions. We ended up with a selection of 18 companies, which are active in a total of 95 countries. And we recorded protest events in 36 different countries. And what we tried to do with this sample as well was to attempt to identify different dimensions of these struggles for a more systematic analysis. So the count we arrived at for the chart for cooked meal delivery worker protests for 2017 to 2020 looked like this. So as you can see, it's not exactly the same trend line. There's an upward curve. There's an upward trend between 2017 and 2019 with that sharp spike, and then something of decline since then. Of course, this is only one sector of platform work. We found 527 instances of platform worker protests in this period, and that's how they spread. Again, as I said before, the issues, when we looked at the issues in these protest events that were driving these protest events, pay came out right at the top. So 63% were overpaid. We found quite often that it was quite common for platform worker protests to have more than one issue involved. So we coded for everything that we found, but pay far and away came out at the top. And you can see deactivation of what we might call algorithmic issues somewhat further down. So that's what we've that. Check the time. One of the things we tried to look at was what kind of collective organisations were emerging, worker organisations were emerging in these protests. And this is quite a complicated situation. For the purposes of this stage of the research, we grouped countries into continents, and this was the picture for the different forms of worker organisation. So I'll just talk through this a little bit. We have the 5 continents here: Europe, Asia, North America, South America, and Australasia. And we looked at what, according to the reports, this is what kinds of workers' organisation, collective organisation, were in evidence in the reports, were mentioned in the reports. And by far the big winner, as I've mentioned earlier, is the purple bars, which is groups of workers. So it's just, there's obviously a group of workers involved. In Europe, it was also quite common for there also to be a mention of trade unions, either independent trade unions, so that's the dark blue bars, or established trade unions. So here, we've had many discussions over the terminology. So independent trade union, meaning the new grassroots unions, and established trade unions, the mainstream familiar trade unions, often in big confederations. Again, it's common to have the reports mention both of these groups, or a mixture of these groups. In Europe, we had some instances of workers' collectives, the non-union worker organisations, but they're still quite rare. Of course, the picture was different in different continents. In Asia, we also used data from the China Labour Bureau, where they have good records. You didn't use exactly the same dimensions that we used, but nevertheless, many instances of platform worker protest in China. But of course, on other continents, far less involvement of unions, whether grassroots or established unions. In North America, we were quite surprised we didn't turn up more instances of protest in North America, considering that how much obvious protest there is in ride hailing in North America and in grocery delivery and so on. Food delivery seemed to be a little cooked meal delivery seemed to be a bit quieter. We need to check whether that's a problem with the database or whether that's a real phenomenon. But this is what we found anyway. So yeah, some parts of the world, very little involvement of unions at all. In other parts of the world, more mixed. But the driving force here is informal groups of workers. And so we did some regressions. We did some Mark did the statistics, so any complicated statistical questions you can ask Mark about those. But this is what we found. So we looked at the issues involved in the protest events, the issues behind them. So that's down the right-hand side. The issues then, so a long list of issues: pay, working hours, working conditions, employment status, union representation, deactivation, health and safety, non-pay benefits. Often that was insurance for riders, for push bike riders and so on. We looked at the type of organisations involved: independent trade unions, established trade unions, workers, collectives and group of workers. We looked at the continents, and for each of these we looked at the forms of action. So these are the columns going across: strike or log off, demonstration, legal action and institutionalisation. And there's quite a lot of numbers there. So I've just highlighted some that I think are worth looking at in a little more detail. So there we go. So out of the 527 instances of platform worker protest we found on these searches, as you can see in the top line, 213 of them were strikes and log-offs. So really quite a high proportion of these protest events is stopping work for some period of time. Generally speaking, these are quite small and quite short stoppages. We found most 80%, something like 80% of these strikes and log-offs involve fewer than 100 workers. 15 or 16% between 100 and 1,000 workers, and a small number over 1,000. But most of these are small and short stoppages. To give you some idea, I rechecked the UK government standard for strikes being recorded in official statistics, and most of these events wouldn't qualify. The British criteria that's been in place since 1893 for the size of strikes to be recorded is that if they last less than a day or involve fewer than 10 workers, they won't count, but unless the total number of strike days lost is more than 100. So they have to be if they're very short, they have to be very big to get in the figures. Nevertheless, for a long time, most British strikes were not recorded. They were too short and too small to be recorded in the official figures. But that gives you these kinds of scale, a lot of small strikes. Following the strikes, demonstrations, of course, legal action does appear, but isn't as 16% of the overall events were legal action, which is fewer than we'd expected. But the distribution was essentially in countries where there are established legal employment rights, there's much more likely to be workers pursuing legal action. Looking down the page, looking down to the next line, again, you can see pay highlighted in red was just a very significant driver of these protest events. If we look down to the involvement of the organisations, different organisations involved, the independent trade unions and the established trade unions, the independent trade unions, the kind of spectrum, although they used both of these different types of organisation, used this full spectrum of methods available. There's a shift in the spectrum. So the independent trade unions were more likely to be at the strike and demonstration end of the spectrum, and the established mainstream trade unions were more likely to be at the demonstration and legal action end of the spectrum. We need to investigate further the extent to which that's about location versus the extent to which it's about strategy. But nevertheless, we probably would have expected that kind of difference to be reflected. Nevertheless, the next red line down, the group of workers, it's all about strikes, log-offs and demonstrations. There's some legal action, but not so much. And just finally, the finding for North America. So I thought I'd highlight this since we've got a North American audience. We found only one strike in the period we looked at, only one strike of cooked food delivery workers in North America. 12 legal actions. So this is something we need to check now to see. We've part of the process we need to do is to check the database to see how well it's working, what it's recording exactly against other sources. So far, it's not been too bad, but we are finding some gaps. So that's my talk through that slide. When we were looking at, one of the other things when we were looking at the types of organizations that were involved, the kind of emerging forms of collectivity, we tried to look at coalitions. So here we tried to look, what we looked at here was where there was more than one form of collective organization in evidence, which forms went together, which did we find together? And here what we find is obviously the two big columns are for Europe, where there's commonly coalitions of independent trade unions and a group of workers, and established trade unions and a group of workers. Now, it's quite difficult to, in some ways, to separate group of worker and their union. Nevertheless, they're not identical. So we did find a reasonable number of instances of where reports said that a union was taking action but didn't mention a group of workers. You can imagine situations with more formalized industrial relations setups where that kind of thinking would be more common. So certainly one of the things we noticed was in Australia, it was really with a different legal framing for industrial relations. It was relatively common for unions to pursue legal cases over platform work, where it really wasn't clear that there was much of an involvement of groups of workers, of rank and file workers. That's not to say there weren't, but there was much less in evidence in the reports that we were looking at. In Europe, whereas in Europe, what we find is that those two bars there reflect generally a higher level of some form of unionization of the groups of workers involved in these protest events in Europe. So what this chart here shows really is the different levels of institutionalization, well, different levels of formalization of union organization in different settings. So a higher level of over 60% of the protest events we found in Europe involved a mixture of groups of workers and trade unions, and it was much less involvement of unions in other countries, in other continents, in other settings. So I'd just like to make a few concluding comments. First of all, the limitations. Well, there is some obvious limitations here. First of all, we need to look at in this kind of detail at more sectors. The problem is it's very time consuming. The access we have to online databases now means it's very quick to find examples, to find reports of platform worker protests. It's much more difficult and time consuming to code them and to look for the kind of dimensions that we've looked at. News media reports are often incomplete reports. I mean, it's a bit annoying that they didn't have some consideration for research social scientists when they compiled them, but nevertheless they don't. So coding them is time consuming and difficult. There's some obvious sectoral problems. So online platform work, crowd work, just doesn't appear. The workers' organisation isn't newsworthy in the same way at all. We can discuss how common it might be or how rare, but it doesn't make the news. We have to. It's a very GDELT in particular is a very comprehensive database, and we've checked it out against other sources, but we need to continue that. We need to look at that some more. Nevertheless, despite these problems, the method we've adopted still gives us access to a far larger scale of data on platform worker protests than is typical of the research that's been done so far. So we recognise there are difficulties, but we're quite pleased with what we have been able to get out of it. So just some final comments. I'd just like to change stand back a little bit and look and say something a bit more analytical. Since Virginia Doellgast agreed to be the discussant, I thought I'd say something making use of the framework that she and her colleagues developed a couple of years ago, the institutional inclusivity and exclusivity model, Doellgast, Lillian, Pugliano, 2018. So this is the framework, most of you were aware of this. So it's a framework that links institutional coverage and union strategy and precarious work. And what was interesting about, we've used it in some other work we've been doing. It's a really useful framework because of the way that it links together union strategy and institutional coverage in the context of precarious work. And Virginia and her colleagues, their argument is that essentially there's two contrasting models, the virtuous cycle or the vicious circle. And in a virtuous cycle, precarious workers represented by unions adopting inclusive strategies are able to increase the coverage of the institutions that regulate the labour market, increase the coverage of collective bargaining and so on. And one of the effects of this is to reduce precarity, reduce insecurity, and generate a virtuous cycle of growing inclusivity of precarious workers in the institutionalization and representation of workers and regulation of labour markets, work and labour markets. Alternatively, you can have a vicious circle where failures of unions to adopt inclusive strategies leads to increasing numbers of workers being employed precariously and excluded from coverage and institutional regulation and so on. What's interesting about platform work is that when you look at platform worker protests, it just looks like an experiment in developing inclusive strategies. It looks like groups of workers who are starting to find their feet and find their voices and attempting to develop strategies for getting themselves included in the institutions of work and pay. Despite the novelty of the technology, which has been the focus of an awful lot of the research, when the workers themselves start to do something about their conditions, they take up issues of pay. Where they take up employment status, it's often because of pay or other non-pay benefits. So, and the fact that that the driving force in what we've found so far has clearly been groups of workers, sometimes with unions, sometimes without unions, with different types of unions. There's quite good case study evidence now of groups of workers trying one union and not getting on very well, and then switching and trying another union to see if they get on any better. But really it's something that's being driven from below. So I can't have time to say much more than that really. Just that this is really what it looks like. So I'll go back to slides for the conclusion, and I'll go through these quickly. So just the general conclusions then. First of all, we think it's pretty clear there's really quite significant levels of protest among platform workers. So, you know, yeah, so it's quite, so all the stuff about control, algorithms and control, these workers aren't as controlled as we might have been led to believe. Pay is the main issue, very traditional. It's very much grassroots driven, that we've found, but with some quite interesting and complicated variation and roles that we need to investigate more between grassroots unions, mainstream unions, and the informal groups of workers who are driving a lot of this. Contrasting strategies are clearly there, especially in the differences between the kinds of strategies adopted by established unions and newer grassroots unions, in terms of the methods of struggle that they adopt and some of the demands that they raise. And just finally, it just looks like class formation. It looks like groups of workers getting themselves included, setting out to get themselves included. So a mixture of Beverly Silver and Doellgast et al., we think is just, that's what it's starting to look like. And obviously an unfinished process. I'll leave it there. Stop sharing. That's it from me.
Okay. Thanks, Simon, for that contribution. I think we'll move straight on to Ginny, and then we'll take some general questions after. So Ginny, over to you.
Thanks. I'll try to be really brief because I'm interested to hear what other people here have to say. Thanks for inviting me to the talk. It's really interesting research. I think my main qualification for being a discussant here has to do with this research that Simon was talking about, that I've done with Valeria and Nathan on union strategies toward precarious work. We were focusing on Europe, but I've also done research in the US, so I have a bit of that comparative perspective. And I've also, I feel like this topic just gets discussed in a lot of workshops that I've been involved in recently. Particularly, I helped to organize the Transatlantic Social Dialogue that Cornell, the ETUI, and the Hans Buchler Stiftung in Germany organize annually. And we've had a couple sessions over the past few years where we've had organizers, worker activists from these different platform companies come to talk about their own experiences and to exchange with academics about what they're seeing in their particular companies and in the different countries that they're working in. So I can pull a little bit of that into my comments now. And I'm also organizing an international conference on app-based worker organizing with the Cornell Worker Institute. It's organized by Maria Figueroa, who I see is in the audience. I see her name, if not her face. So hopefully Maria can contribute also to the discussion the time we have left. So first, just as I said at the beginning, I think this project is really important. It's impressive to map these developments in worker organizing and mobilization, to see over 300 protests mapped worldwide, and just to show that you've seen that increase over time, both in the scale as well as the extent and the form that it's taking. And the causes and issues, how those are distributed differently across countries, but also the similarity, the importance of pay across the board. Just important information for us to have as we're trying to understand how workers are protesting in this new emerging area. And I think particularly, I think as you've emphasized here, to try to do some mapping of the worker organizations involved, or what these forms of collective action that are emerging. And it's particularly important analytically to think about, I mean, in this comparative space, what are traditional unions, what role they're playing, and how that role might differ across countries matters. It matters a lot. So another, I think, important contribution, or something that I think you're building off of, or I can see from your comments, the next step really has to do with understanding these regional differences and how institutions matter to them. And I think you sent me another paper, Simon sent me a paper that he's been working on to draw on some of the case study work here as well. And in that paper, he's focusing on some of these differences between, on the one hand, employers are trying to make changes in their policies in the short term, or so the target of action is the employer itself. But on the other hand, there's this target of legal enactment following the webs, right, to change the actual structure of laws. And with this target of building more inclusive institutions so that that collective action is not just having a short-term impact, but a broader one. And again, this connects to another LIRA session I was just at earlier today on sectoral institutions, right? This is the sort of ideal place where you have project-based work, and it would be really useful to have more sectoral forms of bargaining. As well as, of course, just the importance of closing a lot of the legal loopholes where the freelancer contracts often fit between or within this kind of work. So I think, the next step is to think about what we can learn from platform and gig work about how collective action can most effectively close these loopholes, and particularly how these different forms of collective action are making use of existing institutions while also building new ones. And this is where the cross-national comparative information or study really comes in. So for example, it's interesting that pay is the most important cause for protests in most of these regions, but in Western Europe, you found that employment status is most important. And in a way, I think you pointed this out in your comments as well. You see that actually employment status is a way of getting at pay and a whole bunch of other issues in a context where having a normalized standard employment contract gives you access to labor market legislation, stronger welfare state protections, as well as sometimes industrial relations protections, depending on the kind of sectoral bargaining system that's already in place. So if you're moving from a freelance to a standard normal employment contract, that can make a huge difference. And I've seen in other presentations, like in the Nordic countries, it's sometimes just moving from a freelance to a temporary agency contract, which suddenly pulls you into temporary agency worker bargaining system, right? And a whole bunch of protections that go with that. Another example, you found that there was greater involvement of mainstream unions in Western Europe, but also in the UK and Ireland, and the importance of these unofficial unions. And I think in the US, you have worker centers, which I don't know if you categorize them as unofficial unions, or the categorization of what is an official and unofficial union also is embedded in different labor law systems and industrial relation systems. So you see that makes a difference. Also the capacity of unions within these countries, their ability to shift resources to actually pursuing organizing in that space. And then their ability to promise, if we do organize you, we can tie you into some more standard welfare state institutions, or we can actually support worker, like in Germany, the importance of having works councils and trying to press for legal changes where you can organize works councils within these platforms is something that unions can promise that they may not be able to in another context. So questions that I think follow from this, and I don't think it's necessarily questions for analyzing your own database, but perhaps research that follows off of this, because I know you're also doing a series of case studies around this. First, I think one question I have is the role that customers play in these mobilizations and how that differs across countries. And again, given this, you have this dual focus, right, on the one hand, the mobilization around employer and getting the employer to change. On the other hand, mobilization around policy change. And it seems that focus on customers and that direct relationship that a lot of these food delivery workers have with customers can be important in both of those areas, right, as part of broader movements to change the legal framework around freelancer status. So for example, one of our transatlantic social dialogue meetings, we had this guy, Ori Mittenmeier, who was working for this Liefern on Limit initiative of the German union NGG. And he was talking about basically working for a food delivery company in Germany. And he talked a lot about the importance of these direct discussions with the customer, but also then tying them into campaigns on social media, on Facebook, and then putting pressure on the labor minister in Germany, and putting direct pressure on the employer through the customers, threatening to boycott. So it seemed like an important aspect of these strategies is often kind of finding those different points of pressure on both ends through legal change and through direct pressure. Another question, again, is this broader one around national institutions and how they matter not just for the demands and the forms of collective action, which is really the focus of your database, but actually the success of those actions in improving conditions. And I think that's probably much more difficult to measure and to map across all these countries, but something that you can look at more through your case studies. For example, what forms of institution building or legal enactment are best able to improve conditions in these different contexts? And given your focus on these different kinds of coalitions and the involvement of unions, is union involvement in these different forms of union solidarity, is this more likely to help improve conditions in different institutional settings? So again, I think if you're using our framework around inclusive institutions and solidarity building, I also feel like in this space, unions sometimes are sort of seen as not being so trustworthy. And in other cases, they are seen as being legitimate coalition partners. And so sort of who's going to be at the center of these coalitions and what success will they have? So two examples here. I heard a talk by Kirsten Jesnes from FAFO in Norway, and she presented on these Norwegian and Nordic approaches to regulating this work, where you had these employees covered by temp agency CBAs, collective bargaining agreements with the platforms, but also where they were starting to try to set up some broader kinds of collective agreements. And in that case, you would see clearly like unions are at the center and they're really the focus of normalizing that work. On the other hand, we had somebody from this Belgian organization called SMART, the Société Mutuelle Beurratiste, which is like a alternative platform to organize artists and to provide them with social security benefits through the Belgian state, basically. And they got into big conflicts with unions, saying that, this is a new organization that's stepping into their territory and competing with them for members. And that caused all kinds of problems where some platform workers were actually joining this organization as a new form of union. But the traditional unions felt like this was a sort of going rogue and taking them outside of the system and undermining their broader solidaristic power. So I think there's the potential for these kinds of splits, even in the very well-organized labor markets. So those are just a few points to raise. Overall, it's an excellent study. I really look forward to the future findings that come out of it.
Okay, thanks, Ginny. So we have time for some questions. I see that there's two questions in the chat already. Can I ask other colleagues if they'd like to come in, if they can just flag in chat that they'd like to come in or to post a question there. So we have questions from Asaf Bondi and Adrian Eaton. So Asaf, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Hi. I was wondering, thank you very much for both of you, Jeannie and Simon. I wanted to develop Jeannie's comments and ask whether you found different forms of interactions between these new or bottom-up or grassroots actors and the established unions, and I'm especially interested in the differences in these interactions between the decentralized the decentralized context and other contexts that also Jeannie mentions, like in Belgium or Germany, etc.
What do you want to do, Mark? One by one or collect a couple?
Yes, I think we'll take both. So, Adrienne, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, so really, really interesting project. I'd love to look at your database at some point. So my questions, I'm an editor of a book on collective action by informal workers in a number of different countries. It's an edited book. And what I'm wondering is whether you think there's something unique about platform workers that's driving what you're finding, or would we see the same kinds of patterns if we were looking at informal workers who are not necessarily based on platforms? And it's just trying to understand, for me, these categories, right? And what's significant, you know, what does gig mean and what's significant about that versus platform versus informal, which might have a different definition.
Okay, if you're, do you want to answer these, Simon, or do you want me to collect one more question?
Yeah, do another one. There's one.
Okay, so Michael Mathew.
Thank you. This was a great talk, and I'm looking forward to seeing where this project goes in the future. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more how you separated issues of pay from issues of algorithmic transparency. Because on some platforms where the app can withhold payment information, like on Instacart, the platform was found to be pocketing tipping that customers had provided, and that this has contributed to workers' sense of distrust and also has given rise to some collective action, like online petitions against the platform. So I was hoping you could go through how you separated some of those issues, algorithm from pay.
Right, I think there's plenty for you to to go at there, Simon. So back to you.
That'll keep me going. I'm going to, it's 8 o'clock in the evening here in London, so I'm off to open a beer when this is finished, I can tell you. Okay, great questions, thank you. In terms of the different interactions, I'll just do them in order. The differences in the interactions of established and grassroots unions. The problem we've got is that working from online reports, it's very difficult to tell that kind of stuff. That's really going to come down, I think, to case studies. We're able, one of the things that the database is giving us is a picture of where there are clusters. So clusters of contestation around particular issues at particular times or particular platforms. I mean, it's kind of, I don't have the figures down, half a dozen platforms on food delivery account for like 80% of all the protests we've seen. So, but things like outcomes, we can't, it's almost impossible to tell what the outcomes are. Those kind of detailed on the interactions, it's very, very difficult to tell anything with any certainty or to get in. There's just so much missing data in the base that we've got. So that's the kind of thing that we'd really like to know too, but the database just won't tell us that. The question about what's distinctive about platform work, we take the view at Leeds that a lot of people treat platform work as entirely distinctive on the basis of its technology or on the basis of the triangle of platform, worker and customer and so on. We take the view at Leeds that really platform work is another form of insecure work. It's on that spectrum. So it's in terms of the questions about so in that sense, I wouldn't expect what we found to be identical with what we find in other, for all other insecure workers, or including informal workers. But I expect them to be on the same spectrum. I don't expect what we've got to be qualitatively different from the kinds of dynamics and considerations that we find for other groups of insecure workers. That's what I'd say to that. And the institutional setting, I think, will be much more important than whether people's work is directed by an app or whether it's directed by a work agency or whatever. And the final one, the question about pay and algorithmic transparency. Yeah, we didn't really distinguish between these. What we did was we coded for reports where the report said this is what the workers were complaining about. And although we did find some that are clearly where the algorithm came to the fore. So things of issues of unfair deactivation and so on. And there's no question that the algorithmic interface is used to attempt to disguise who's getting paid what, how much the customer's paying, how much the workers are getting paid, what happened to the tips, all the Instacart stuff as I've been following with great interest in collective bargaining by social media. It's fantastic innovation. But just going on the reports of what the workers said they were protesting over, if they said pay, we tick pay. If they said other things, we ticked other things as well. But they just keep saying it's about pay. So that's why we did it like we did.
Okay, I think I'll take one final question from Wilma Liebman.
Yeah, hi. My question was whether in your study you've seen any incidents of collective bargaining between platform workers and platforms as opposed to just protest activity.
We've found very little of that in the database. Again, for the reasons that what we find is reports when something happens. So I mean, this is almost universally is almost completely non-institutionalized. So it doesn't look like the formalized. Here's the demand. You know, here's the disagreement. Here's the dispute period. Here's the failure to agree. Those kinds of things. And here's a strike, and here's an outcome of the dispute. The end of the pay round for that year. That's just not there at all. So it's difficult to say. You know, there can be a whole bunch of protest events with seemingly no outcome, and then another protest event, and the company changes the pay structure or something. So it's very difficult to say, to link together the protest events and a particular outcome. It's quite often difficult just to find out what the outcome was in any case. Some of the case study work we've done in the UK, we've found a kind of form of collective bargaining by shouting at a distance. So it's a bit reminiscent of Batstone's arm's length bargaining. I don't know if you've come across that, which is a study that Eric Batstone did in the 80s of collective bargaining in France, where the two sides wouldn't even sit in the same room as each other, but nevertheless managed to gauge what each side wanted and come to some sort of, at least the end of that bit of fighting, and we would get a pay rise and then we'll see you next year. So there's some of that. And I think the Instacart stuff is really interesting because this goes back to something that Ginny said. It's the involvement of customers. And we've kind of thought about it as the involvement of civil society as well, because you do get these kind of ad hoc coordination, loose coordinations of worker protests, interested journalists, political voices getting involved. The tech media carries an awful lot of stuff on platform worker protests. The kind of Silicon Valley liberalism meets what the companies are actually like. Yeah, that's the kind of stage that collective bargaining is at the moment. And I've been reading 19th century history, some of the really early pre-formalized collective bargaining that took place in the UK in the early mid-19th century. There was a lot of collective bargaining with really low levels of union organization in some industries. And it was just, it didn't look like what we think of as collective bargaining. But nevertheless, workers expressed demands, employers made concessions, and everybody got on with the job. So that's kind of the level of it we're at the moment, I think.
Thank you.
Or possibly a bit below that, but anyway, that's the kind of picture.
Thanks.
Okay, Thanks, Simon. I think we're pretty much out of time. Ginny, I don't know if you want to make a few final closing remarks.
Nope. I think you covered all the questions. I just, oh, it didn't actually send. Let's see. I've sent a link to a report on formal collective bargaining platforms in the Nordics that this woman, Kirsten Jesnes, was involved in. I think that might answer some of Wilma's questions about formal collective bargaining. I know like there's a agreement in Denmark between platforms providing cleaning work and the Cleaning Workers Union, and there are some models that I think are as is usually the case, most developed in some of the Nordics.
Yeah, there's a paper by Anna Ilsoe on the Danish case as well, the 3F agreement there.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks, Mark. Thanks everybody.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So thanks, Ginny. Thanks, Simon. I think that was a good opportunity to introduce the Leeds Index on platform protest. As Simon said, this is ongoing work, and we've been recently working with the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Germany and also the International Labour Office to extend the base of this index. But it's quite laborious work. So we're also looking at how we can perhaps automate some of this to expand the scope. So hopefully we'll be able to meet you all in person next year and present this really live, but we shall see. Okay, so thanks everyone. Thanks again, Simon and Ginny, and I hope everyone enjoyed the session.
Very
Take
much.
care.